Hello and welcome to the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm Patrick McNicholas, the artist and researcher behind Time Travel Tulsa, and as always, I'm joined with local historian and friend John Beasley. In this show, we discuss Tulsa's past, present, and future, so sit back and relax as we talk Tulsa Times. Thanks for joining us and welcome back to the fourth edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. And it's officially May, and even though this episode is a little behind schedule, it seems like it was kind of meant to be because of all the big news that kept coming in Tulsa since we last recorded. Patrick and John here, of course, and our guest who will join us a little later in the episode, Jake Cornwell, the horsehide historian. We'll discuss the history of baseball in Tulsa and Oklahoma, so get ready for that. But first, let's talk about the elephant in the room and jump into the recent news, and that happens to be the biggest development, which John had some personal experience with. The Bob Dylan Center opened earlier this week on Tuesday, and what was that like? Because you were there even before the grand opening. You were there the weekend before because they had a wild weekend at Cain's last week.
It was indeed. It was a fantastic weekend, great weekend for Tulsa. I was honored to be asked to help with the opening of the Bob Dylan Center, so I was hanging out there through most of the weekend. We had some VIP tours, people coming through, hanging out. Really enjoyed the opening on Tuesday because that's when Tulsans got to come in, so I acted as host on Tuesday for opening day. Got to see a lot of folks from Tulsa. Got to visit with a lot of people, and yeah, that's an amazing facility. To be honest with you, I didn't know a lot about Bob Dylan before I was asked to help with the opening, so it was kind of a crash course, and I come to really appreciate his work from 61 to 64, what they call the Greenwich Village years, which really for me is the Woody Guthrie years, because without Woody Guthrie, there would be no Bob Dylan. Woody's influence on Dylan was amazing, and so yeah, but it's a great space. I encourage everybody to check it out. It is state of the art. There are archives. It's amazing some of the things that they have come up with, from the tambourine that inspired Mr. Tambourine Man to a lot of his notes. He's quite the writer, and spent most of his time rewriting, lots of revisions. You see things like Joker Man, one of his great songs, that was pinned out on the hotel stationery, from where he was staying on those nights during that tour. But I really appreciate the Creators exhibit, the gallery upstairs. Jerry Schatzman, who took many famous photographs of Dylan, including the one that was spray painted on the front of that building. So, but that will rotate every 4 to 6 months or so. It will feature a new creator. Also, the 6 songs featured in the main gallery will rotate out as well. So while you go in and get to see a lot of, how the 6 songs that are currently on exhibit came to be, in 6 months, you will see completely different 6 songs by Bob Dylan.
Well, Robert Zimmerman himself, he was here in Tulsa, but he didn't stop by the center. But, if he made the amount of money that he did for selling those archives, I think that he was kind of ready to part ways with his archive. And there's other artists trying to do the same thing, but it's amazing, turning 81 later this month, and 60 years since his first album.
We will have a birthday cake ready for him, just in case he decides to show up and celebrate his birthday with us. He did, make an appearance at a Drillers game while he was in town in April.
He did?
He did, yes.
Yeah,
he was there.
Yeah. There wasn't any news.
Apparently.
Was there news about that?
Nope, not at all. So he had on a hoodie, kind of worked his way through the crowd, and was able to then relax and enjoy a game. But yeah, so Bob Dylan did get to experience a Tulsa Drillers game while he was here in town.
Well,
but
obviously,
skip the museum.
Obviously, we'll talk baseball coming up, but that story didn't make it everywhere, but The story of the museum was on Sunday morning, national news basically everywhere, but the other huge story is a year later after the centennial, and that's the Greenwood survivor case against the city is allowed to continue, and a trial will take place. And from what I've read, it's the furthest a case like this for reparations has made in the country. And of course, that's still unfolding, but we'll find out what happens in the near future.
Yeah, as a Tulsan, I recognize that the city of Tulsa did promise some reparations. There was supposed to be, some compensation for those people. And while you and I, weren't obviously around in 1921, we are the city of Tulsa. And the city of Tulsa today still needs to live up to those commitments that the city of Tulsa made 100 years ago.
And again, a lot to unpack, and we'll find out what happens with that. But we appreciate everyone who's listened to our episodes so far. In our last episode on Route 66, really to bookend that, Reese Martin, our guest, he was interviewed by the Google local guides team, and it was about Route 66, of course. And this article was found alongside the Google Doodle that was featured on the Google homepage, and became the number 2 in popularity. When I looked at it, it could have possibly become the number 1 video on YouTube, but it was celebrating Route 66, and it was kind of an interesting artistic Google Doodle, I guess you could say. But when it comes to Route 66 news, we know that John, in your neighborhood, the Riverview, is going to be directly affected by the continuation of the Route 66 Interpretive Center, as I think
there you
is
Don't
what it's
call
called
it
now.
a museum. It is a Route 66 Interpretive Center. It is an experience. So that'll be the name, Route 66 Experience. I remember going to some meetings with Michael Wallace back in 2015 or so. This has been kind of in the
That's
works
when it was
for a long time. Yeah, so finally, I'm really glad to see that it is finally hopefully coming to fruition.
and the most ambitious, I would say, out of everything, 40-room hotel named after Cyrus Avery, the Hotel Avery, amphitheater, and I think it's going to turn that neighborhood in a little different direction than the kind of chilled out neighborhood that it is.
Right? I don't know, because that is on the side of Crybaby Hill. There will be some terraforming, but I've seen the renderings, and Lawton, which is that first stretch of the hill that they ride up on the Sunday Tulsa Tough event on Crybaby Hill, that part of the hill will remain intact. So
and that will be coming up as it continues to get hotter outside. The beginning of June. But speaking Route 66, one other last thing that Tulsa did, an addition to the Mother Road Market, the visitor center that will be opening, or already has opened there at 11th and Lewis. Probably one of the worst intersections right now to drive through. I was there earlier.
It has been under construction for years. So frustrating.
And that large building that they're building next to it looked like they had all this structure up. And I drove by the other day and it looked like something just knocked it all over. And it didn't look like it was supposed to be like that, but it was cleaned up shortly thereafter. But again, every week it's a new development. And Tulsa's been doing, in fact, it was one of the largest city budgets in Tulsa history that we just announced. But the Evans FinTube site, I think, is even more ambitious than the Route 66 Centennial location. And that's in Greenwood, of course. Emmett Smith was here as one of the developers. Not one that was selected, but the one that was selected was the one that chose to leave the Oklahoma Iron Works building in place, and that is on the National Register, thankfully, to someone that we know that used to be the head of TFA, and she really helped with that building, and a lot of people didn't really understand her vision at the time, but now we do. 42-story skyscraper called the Beacon is what they're going to be adding next to it. And that's the first 40-floor building in Tulsa since 1979. The much-used Cityplex Towers, which I'm being a little facetious there. They're talking about with the Beacon building in that area near US BMX, potential for rooftop dining and a hotel, including mixed income housing. But developers, again, are hopeful to begin construction within the next year. A lot of things still in motion for that. Shortly after the recording of our last episode, Matt Dillon actually visited the Outsiders' house. And this is significant because it was his first time to stop by, but he was also in the Outsiders Tex and Rumblefish, and S.E. Hinton was there and accompanied him as well.
We love Susie.
And also, actor Sylvester Stallone filmed parts of the new series Tulsa King in town, and he was at the airport, Center of the Universe, Union Depot, and even Triangle Coffee. I'm sure there were more locations. I know there were more in Oklahoma City. We'll see how that series turns out. I really don't know what to expect with that one. Another cool thing, StoryCorps was in town. They did their mobile stop, and they were here to, as they say, record, preserve, and share the stories. And so they've recorded over 500,000 people since 2003, and all of those go into the Library of Congress. And they've even interviewed John Hope Franklin, who before his death. So they have quite the archive. And also check that out if you haven't. There's a great 60 minutes on that. But so much more I want to add to the recent developments, but we really must move on. And we're going to jump right into the sports world.
Sports!
And that will bring us to our main topic of this episode. But biggest news, again, PGA back in town since 2007, and this is going to be the 8th major, 5 championships for Southern Hills down there. And if you don't even follow golf, of course you've heard the names Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and even Tiger Woods, who won in 2007, and it was here just 2 weeks ago and stopped by about a week ago. And of course he was wearing that red shirt, and a lot of his iconic highlights are from the Tulsa Southern Hills course. And speaking of highlights, they've actually brought it back to the original 1935 design that was partially funded by Wade Phillips. And what's great about this event is that we're going to have over 40,000 people there, great production value of Tulsa bump shots like the ones we see at the TU football games, and also employing many, many Tulsans. But also a possible severe weather factor, so we're going to have to wait and see with that. One thing I want to mention is the first Tulsa Derby, which was FC Tulsa and Tulsa Athletic. They kind of refused to play the Athletic for a number of years, but due to the fact of the Athletic winning in the U.S. Open, they were able to play them, and that was a one Oak Field game, but FC Tulsa ended up on the high side. But speaking of the Athletic, they won their first game 5-1 last week and first home game this Sunday. The first bike polo tournament was also held in early April.
And speaking of cycling sports, the 22nd of this month is the Ironman makes its return to Tulsa. So they're starting with the swimming out at Keystone Lake this year. So watch for road closures as there's a 115-mile bike ride before they end up down in the Riverview neighborhood. A majority of that marathon portion will be on the River Parks trails over there in the Riverview neighborhood past the Gathering Place. And of course, more cycling news. Next month is Tulsa Tough. So the 10th through the 12th, always a great time in the Riverview neighborhood as we host the Crybaby Hill on Sunday, June 12th. Hope to see y'all out there.
And we got to give a round of applause to anyone that wants to exercise in the heat of early June, Oklahoma. So lots of water. Be sure to stay hydrated. But on the other end of the spectrum, in the ice world, the Oilers made it to the playoffs. But unfortunately, even though it was a good series, they lost in Game 7 in the first round to Utah Grizzlies. I worked actually Game 3, 4, and 5. They were back-to-back. And Game 4 was an amazing just to see the Tulsa crowd. The Drillers game's a little more usual to see that kind of crowd, but the Oilers were really having quite the night there. And speaking of them, they actually made it public that they're going to try to turn the Promenade Mall into a skate facility. But back to the Drillers, as we were talking, off to a hot start. And opening night was April 12th. The last home game will be September 17th, barring any playoff chances. But they scored 16 points on April 23rd, 13 points in another. But we've made it to baseball. That's our main topic. And we're lucky enough to score one of the most knowledgeable baseball historians in town for this series, part 1 of Tulsa sports history.
I'm excited to talk about Tulsa baseball history because I have no doubt that baseballs, gloves, and bats were amongst the very first items to arrive with the builders of the 1882 Frisco Railroad. The baseball in Tulsa precedes the city of Tulsa by many, many decades. One of my favorite stories is the McBurney brothers, how they were brought to Tulsa more for their baseball abilities than their bookkeeping skills. Tulsa Historical Society has a picture of the 1897 Townie team, which included the McBurney brothers. James McBurney is just one of those great stories. So his first job in banking was as a janitor in Columbus, Kansas, and several years later, he was brought to Tulsa as, quote, a bookkeeper / baseball player, along with his kid brother, Sam. Sam McBurney was later the head football coach at Tulsa High School and the head football coach at the University of Tulsa, while James went on to found the Bank of Commerce, which we have discussed a couple of times in the earlier episodes. And then in 1928, he built that glorious McBurney mansion, that Tudor Revival mansion at 1414 South Galveston in my neighborhood, the Riverview neighborhood. And so Tulsa has a long, celebrated, and very interesting relationship with the game of baseball. Names like team names like Producers, Railroaders, and Rumblers. Names like Dizzy Dean and Warren Spahn, Sammy Sosa and Pudge Rodriguez, Cody Bellinger, Corey Seager, and Jake Cornwell.
And that's why we chose this to be our 4th episode. So without any further ado, I want to introduce our guest for this episode. Jake Cornwell is a cultural historian, award-winning writer, professor, and popular cultural enthusiast from Tulsa. He has written extensively about race and baseball, lowrider culture around the country, and has interviewed several notable celebrities in music, movies, and other aspects of popular culture. Cornwell frequently lectures and curates exhibits across Oklahoma and teaches about sports, automotive, and leisure cultures at Oklahoma State University. And one other thing we want to mention, he's also the founder and curator of the Oklahoma Baseball Archive, a growing collection of artifacts, photos, and oral history that seek to preserve the vast history of baseball as it pertains to Oklahoma. And we want to welcome in Jake. Thanks for being a part of this podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So could you explain the name Horsehide Historian? Because when I mention you, people are like, I don't know if I've heard of him, but when I mention Horsehide Historian, they're like, oh yeah, that guy. So what's the story behind that?
It's a charming moniker, at least I think so. The reason why I chose horsehide is because Major League Baseball used horsehide leather up until 1973, 1974. So the scope of what I cover within baseball history basically follows that timeline. So all of the players that I write about and I research, they played with a horsehide baseball instead of the cowhide that is played with now. So because that was a finite timeline with when they stopped using horsehide leather, and it just kind of, it rolls off the tongue, the double H's there. Mm-hmm. So I chose that, and it worked out as a moniker that people recognize and know.
So this baseball archive, obviously you're the founder of it, but how long has this baseball archive been going?
The Oklahoma Baseball Archive is an outgrowth of a collection with the foresight to use this for people beyond our years. So it's not just for me and the satisfaction of knowing that these players had some kind of connection to Oklahoma. It's actually an archive in that it should be used by multiple people. It's been a passion project to curate and collect artifacts and ephemeral pieces and photographs and other, interesting pieces that document Oklahoma baseball, from Little League to college, from minor league to major league, from Negro League to recreational or industrial league, and anything and everything in between. If there's a story that is tangible and it somehow represents Oklahoma, then it should be housed within that. And that's what the project has really come to be.
And it's called the Oklahoma Baseball Archive, but when we were at your house, you obviously have stuff from outside of Oklahoma, the memorabilia that the Field of Dreams dirt or the chair from Wrigley Field. I mean, so you're kind of an all-around baseball historian, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's actually a chair from Comiskey Park. So
oh, okay.
The other side of Chicago. But yes, it's a Chicago seat. It's from Comiskey Park. It's a green seat. It's actually produced by Haywood Wakefield. And for those who know about mid-century furniture, Haywood Wakefield is a well-known furniture maker from that time. Well, this seat was produced in the 1900s and was used in Comiskey Park. That seat and the patrons who sat in that seat saw the Black Sox scandal whenever the White Sox threw the World Series in 1919, the subsequent things that happened, the banning of Shoeless Joe Jackson. But beyond that is that from my interest and my focus with researching and learning about the Negro Leagues, the league that existed outside of white baseball, is that the East-West games, the Negro League East-West games, the ones that showcase the talents of the best black ball players in the United States, they played in Comiskey Park. So, and then growing up in the 1990s, I followed the Chicago White Sox for quite some time as they were building the new cookie cutter stadiums in the 1990s. That's also the era of Robin Ventura, who was an OSU Cowboy before he went on into the major league. So there's a lot of connection to that seat. Yes, I have other things. I've been fortunate to play Sandlot baseball for about a half decade now. And last year, the team that I co-founded with Josh Camp, who works for Tulsa People magazine, he's the head marketing guy there. He and I created this team, and through the investment of all these guys that are on the squad, and we all play for the right reasons, we get to do these great things as Sandlotters. And last year we played at the Field of Dreams. That was, if we'd have stopped at that point, it would have been the best game that we ever played. But being able to be on that dirt, the same dirt that, Kevin Costner or, John and Ray Kinsella, they kind of had out there, want to have a catch moment. And I got to do that. And, there were a lot of blurry eyes at times when we were there.
So that Sandlot team, that's the Rumblers, right? Tulsa Rumblers. Let's, how did that come about, and what's the future of Sandlot baseball in Tulsa, and how can people get involved in Sandlot?
Yeah, actually, that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask, but I wanted to go back even a little bit further because you posted a thing that said, quote unquote, the Sandlot Revolution. So there's more to this than just what we see on the surface.
Yeah, hashtag Sandlot Revolution. Tulsa Sandlotters have been playing for about 6 or 7 years now. Sandlot was brought to Tulsa by the Tulsa City Saturns, who established the Tulsa Sandlot Society. And then through the growth and popularity of this thing called the Sandlot Revolution, this was an outgrowth of the popularity of grassroots baseball in Austin, Texas. There are short documentaries about this man named Jack Sanders, an architect who lives in Austin. And he learned about this kind of organic baseball from these African-American ball players who had been playing on the same ball field for 80 years in Alabama whenever he was pursuing his architectural degree. Well, fast forward, he was in Austin about 12 years later, and he realized that he was missing what he had discovered in Alabama. And he got together with some of his guys, and they, too, recognized that they had this void in their life. And through, just get-togethers and those kind of things, they played some baseball, and then it became more popular. There was another team that popped up. And then eventually this guy, Jack Sanders, builds his own Field of Dreams in East Austin, I believe. And it's called The Long Time. And it truly is like this magical place. I remember the first time I went there, I roll up and it's in hill country. So you've got the live oak trees that are just gnarly and have all those branches sprawled in such chaotic but beautiful ways. But as you pull up and you see all of this beauty and you're out in the Texas hill country, I see this Cadillac convertible with bull horns on the hood, and I just knew that I had made it. Sitting right next to it was a baseball field, and it truly was this real-life Field of Dreams. And through those experiences, the camaraderie that follows with the Sandlot Revolution is that there are, I think, 18, 16 teams, something like that in Austin now, and it's grown. There's Sandlot teams in Vancouver, Canada. There are Sandlot teams in North Carolina. There are Sandlot teams all over Texas now, and now there are Sandlot teams all over Oklahoma. It is really spreading across the nation like wildfire.
And to answer John's question, you don't need to be drafted to be on these teams, correct?
You don't even need to have ever played baseball.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, there's really no hurdle to jump through. I mean,
you have to be a lover of baseball, and you have to be a decent person.
Well, I grew up playing baseball, and of course, John's major Driller fan. You even threw out a first pitch.
It was a pleasure. It's been a number of years.
Have you got that opportunity? I know I haven't.
I have not yet.
Yeah, and how did you get that opportunity exactly?
It was, one of those. It was back in the days when I was an environmental activist, and it was one of those green, they do the green environmentally friendly nights, and so somehow randomly, actually, I happen to know a guy. Let's talk about Taylor at the Drillers.
Okay.
So, it was an environmental night, and the first guy that Taylor thought of was, well, hey, what about Beasley? See if he's available.
It pays off, I guess. Yeah.
We at the Rumblers know Taylor very well, too. Mm-hmm. He's a great guy and a great asset for the Tulsa Drillers.
And obviously, the Rumblers is an ode to something that we know very well. Not Rumble Fish, but the Outsiders, more of an Outsiders relation, correct?
Well, it's actually a mashup.
Oh, okay.
I got my degree in American Studies, and part of that is studying literature. And I went back to college at the right time, and I took many classes that were based in Oklahoma literature and Oklahoma movies. And you can't talk about Oklahoma literature and Oklahoma movies without talking about Essie Hinton. And I've met Essie, and I've talked to her several times, and she's a great mentor for those who care about what I call the Tulsa-Rati. It's this literati coalition of people who care about the spoken and written word, and she's one of those leaders. I mean, she created YA, young adult fiction. So through that, she wrote The Outsiders, and it became this great blockbuster for Francis Ford Coppola. But beyond that, she also wrote Rumblefish. And so because both of those films were filmed in Tulsa, we wanted to give an ode to The Outsiders, but we also wanted to include Rumblefish within that. And so it just kind of like Josh and I had played around with words, and we settled on the Rumblers that felt right. You have Dallas Winston, and he says, it ain't a rumble unless I'm involved, right? So with that, it's an homage to SE, and it's an homage to Tulsa history, especially as it relates to that.
And a great graphic design, too, whoever put that together with the switchblade as the fork of the R there, the structure of the R.
It's iconic. It's one of those things that it's for us, it's like the New York Yankees interlocking NY. It's that iconic, and it's popular with more than just baseball fans.
I really enjoyed reading many of your published works. I specifically remember your description of the day that part of the stadium collapsed here in Tulsa. And just for our last episode, we referenced your interview with Michael Wallace. So how did all of your interests come together?
I appreciate that, John. One of those things is that as an aspiring artist, you mimic those that you most respect and that you most love. And I've joked with people about this before, is it very rarely is your favorite author, one, still alive, and even more rare is your favorite author in the same community that you're in. So Michael Wallace has been my favorite author since he authored Route 66 back in the 1990s. And because of that, and I grew up, as a car enthusiast, but then built custom cars professionally for some 22 years, that all just kind of was this perfect storm that came together, and I read that book voraciously, and I learned about this written word and how you can paint pictures with words. And so when I went back to college and it was a rebuilding of my life, I could no longer work on cars. That's whenever I took those classes that I talked about. And one of the things that we learned about beyond S.E. Hinton's works is we read Michael Wallace. And I read Michael Wallace's Way Down Yonder in the Indian Nation. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's this anthology of just seemingly trivial instances of people in Oklahoma. It's from people who are, barbecue aficionados, or a mentally ill person who played for the OU Sooners, or this old redneck stretching barbed wire across the plains. Those are seemingly trivial, but whenever you read Michael Wallace and the way that he creates this nonfiction, but it's poetry, that is one thing that lasts with you. And as I became an early writer, I learned the power of the verb. And whenever you learn the power of the verb, the adjectives come along with that. And so through those experiences, I was fortunate enough to go to many events that Michael was there. And Michael has become a friend of mine. He was an early mentor of mine. And I can't sing his praises enough. I mean, he's done so much for popular culture history. He's done so much for Tulsa. And, through his letting me shadow him for so long, that he has now mentored the next generation. And I've been fortunate to be able to help, sing that same, serenade of a state that I love so much. To the point about the stadium collapse, these accidents that happen that turn out to be these just wonderful turn of events, is that Roy Clark was a friend of mine. And I met him through working for Jim Halsey, who was Roy's manager for all of his career, basically. Mm-hmm. And so Roy and we talked baseball, because I knew that Roy was the first owner of the Tulsa Drillers. And so when we would sit and we'd just talk about, all things baseball and, just anything that we didn't talk about music, we talked about everything else. And so he and I talked about his time as the owner for the Drillers, and he said that, yeah, I owned the Drillers in 1977. I said, well, yeah, that's the year that the stadium collapsed. He said, that was my first introduction to baseball. And he didn't know what he had gotten himself into at that point. He thought, this is going to bankrupt me.
Right.
After that happened.
Yeah.
And they went to inspect that after. Fortunately, no one died in that collapse. And there had been another stadium baseball collapse in the 19-teens. So someone had died in that. So in that instance, he was lucky. There were people injured and who had some sustaining injuries after that. But whenever they went to inspect the ballpark, he said it's amazing that ballpark withstood as long as it did. It was a wood baseball park, and he said that for all intents and purposes, the only thing that was holding that stadium together was the paint, because they would paint it every year.
Right.
And whenever you just saw every part of that piece of wood was rotted out from the interior, but the paint was so thick because they painted it every year.
Wow.
And that's at the fair. That was located at the fairgrounds.
Yeah, where they put the home plate to commemorate where Texas League Park, which was belovedly known as Oiler Park, that's where it was.
That was the parking lot, right? When we went to Drillers Stadium.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes, just to the west.
And what's crazy is that after 7 stadiums, 59 seasons, and 16 championships, the Oilers finally left Tulsa for good, and ironically became the name of the NBA team down there, the New Orleans Pelicans, and even more ironically played in the Superdome for the first season. But that's when the Drillers from Lafayette, Louisiana relocated, and again, that was Roy Clark. I read that he was a co-owner of the team, but he was the
Bill
main...
Rawlings.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Bill
So
Rawlings is the guy who kind of orchestrated the deal. Roy was a money man, of course, but Roy, if he had not become an entertainer, he would have become a baseball player. He actually had a tryout with the St. Louis Browns. So Roy was a baseball man through and through, and he said if I couldn't play my way into the game, I was going to pay my way into the game.
So when we look back at really all these decades of baseball, what is your favorite that you, and it doesn't have to be Tulsa specific, but what is the period of time that really, that you think of the most, or I guess what's the most memorable that kind of makes the biggest impact?
For me, I study so much of the game, and I tell a lot of people that this is a passion project because I would be doing this regardless. But what I'm drawn to the most is the eras that I didn't get to experience. If you look up what are my key eBay searches, Tulsa Oilers is probably the largest search web that I have.
Okay.
And that's because there were so many important people who played on the Tulsa Oilers. Now, that's a team that lasted for a long, long, long time, from the 19-teens to 1976. What was it, 1919 that they changed to Tulsa Oilers?
Yeah, there was, like John mentioned at the very beginning, the Railroaders, the Producers,
The Terriers.
Then eventually,
The Terriers.
Yes.
Now, we did have an Oilers team in 1905, but
yeah,
there was one in
many
1913
changes.
those names are interesting.
But
you mentioned that Lafayette team, which was actually named the Drillers even before they came to Tulsa.
But they weren't around for very long prior to that, from what I remember. But one of the important things is when you're researching this, I have my go-to places, but if you're looking for this information, where's the first place that you may go to a search engine to try to find some of this information?
It depends on what you're looking for.
Okay.
I try to compound every question. It depends on what you're looking for. Most of the time, it's through newspaper coverage.
Yeah.
You can find that because depending on what you're looking for, you can find that through searchability. There's so many digitized newspapers now. The Oklahoma Historical Society has the Gateway. The Gateway is a great resource for finding Oklahoma newspapers. You can subscribe to different newspaper archives like newspapers.com and Newspaper Archive.
I'm a member, actually, so that's where I find some of my most unique stuff, but you also have to take it with a grain of salt because they write it before it happens, and sometimes you don't hear the story after
a lot of times
event. So if it comes to certain things, you kind of have to.
I usually try to cross-reference my sources.
Of course.
If it's through interview or if it's from one account to another. One of the best examples I can say is that I discovered this. It was actually the first segregation of Association Park. I found a verbatim article printed in the Tulsa Star, which was the African American newspaper of the time. And you can only take that for what it's worth. If it's a source saying that another source said this, then you can only say whatever that source is saying. Mm-hmm. But then what you can do is you can corroborate that with another piece of evidence. And the very next day, the white newspaper said that they were going to segregate that ballpark. So that's how you're able to do that. Newspapers have so much information. People don't really think about what you can get out of it because it's only words, but if you know what you're looking for, but you also have to know within the era, well, like what the nomenclature is of the time.
I was going to mention that. I have to look up definitions of certain things because they name it differently.
It's even simple words like fast. Mm-hmm. Fast meant something totally different at the turn of the 20th century. Fast meant good. Fast meant competent. They are going to be a fast team. And you only learn that because, for me, I immersed myself in it, and you find that this is verbiage that they're using for many things. But newspapers are great, but I think that any person who's an enthusiast should not be afraid of contacting whatever archive that they have in their community, whether that is a small town regional museum or whether it's something like the Tulsa Historical Society or Oklahoma Historical Society, is that they exist for people to find information. And if that's something they're interested in, look, armchair historians are just as competent and passionate as academic historians. And the only difference is source material in many instances. So, is that if I were to be able to give anybody advice, is to use the resources that you have. And if you're curious about that, you will find a path that unfolds whatever information that you're looking for.
And speaking of those small museums, Commerce, Oklahoma, Mickey Mantle's hometown, isn't there a museum in his honor there?
There are several homages. There are baseball parks named after him and his father, and the house that Mickey Mantle lived in is on the National Register, and they are preserving that. They've tried to build a museum 3 different times. I know the Mantle family, and just through different instances, 3 different times they haven't been able to build that museum. That's kind of like my pipe dream, is that somehow the Oklahoma Baseball Archive becomes a wing of the Mickey Mantle Museum. And
they still have all the memorabilia, and they didn't get rid of anything, right?
Well, there was an auction in the early 2000s that they auctioned off a lot of it. But, I mean, Mickey Mantle is an international icon. I mentioned that with Babe Ruth earlier, but, like, you can not know anything about baseball and know who Mickey Mantle is. So he's pervasive within popular culture. And so if there were a museum in his honor, you would be able to find that material to fill a museum.
Mickey Mantle is the reason that I'm a Yankees fan, because my dad was a Yankees fan because of Mickey Mantle.
And, I mean, of course, there were other people that aren't from Oklahoma, but that were here briefly. Roger Maris, who you actually have memorabilia of, a physical copy, right?
Yeah, I actually have a Tulsa Oilers program from Roger Maris's time in Tulsa Oilers uniform. His name is spelled differently because back then his birth name was Maras. Maris, but people kept pronouncing it differently, so he changed it to the way it sounded after his time in Tulsa.
It makes sense. And, of course, in your bio, you're a professor, but in order to become a professor, you had a master thesis playing between the lines in an examination of Negro League baseball in Oklahoma, 1892 to 1965. And so I know that there's a lot to unpack here. I guess where's the best place to start with the chronicled black baseball in Oklahoma?
You would think you would start at the beginning, but for me, I didn't. I started in 2011. In 2011, the Tulsa Drillers started to pay homage to former black ball players, and that was the first year that they donned these throwback T-Town Clowns jerseys. And I considered myself, even at that time, to be an in-the-know guy, but I was still pursuing my degree. And somehow this slipped through my grasp and through my scope, and I didn't know that that was happening. I only read 3 days after the fact that they had these former Negro League players, and they were out throwing first pitches, and the surviving family members were celebrated on the field. And I remember in that moment wishing that I could have just met those men and maybe shaken their hand or even got an autographed baseball. And it was very just like, it was at the surface of, interest. And I would not know later that I would be able to, one, meet some of those people, but befriend them and, develop these relationships with them that, they carry on with you, that you become surrogate family members with them. And so in 2011, I learned about, that these people were still in our community. And I had already known about teams like the Tulsa Black Whalers and the Tulsa T-Town Clowns and the Oklahoma City Black Indians. And I remember saying to myself that I wish somebody would write a book. And there wasn't anybody doing that. I remember going on the internet and looking up these team players and these team names. And I only found one page that was literally one page from the Oklahoma Historical Society that mentions the history of black baseball. And on that page, they list those teams. And I was hungry with curiosity. And after that, I began studying baseball much more intimately. And, this has all just been a passion project. And through that, you make phone calls and you do this networking. And the next thing you know is you call five people, and 5 people later, you're talking to one of the people that lived through, an ugly era in our town and state's history. But opened me with welcoming arms, and we took in baseball games together and shared many meals, and those kind of guys that you develop a relationship with, and it lasts forever. And so through those stories that I learned from them, I'm able to cultivate through what I call these hidden histories in plain sight. I call it that because when I began to study these projects or these teams and these players, is that many times there was press on them. And it wasn't just black press. The Tulsa World and Tulsa Tribune would often cover these teams. And so through that, and then having this firsthand knowledge, Sylvester Nichols and Porter Reed from Muskogee, Oklahoma, both of these men were these just encyclopedias of knowledge, and were able to recount the people that they had played with who had already passed on and gone, and taught me so many things. Is that, did you know that Tulsa had an all-female black baseball team in the 1930s? I didn't either until I met Sylvester Nichols. And so these are the stories that became the outgrowth of my master's thesis, and now is my book project. I became intimately connected to the Tulsa T-Town Clowns through Sylvester Nichols. Sylvester Nichols was the original second baseman for the 1946 Tulsa T-Town Clowns. There was this great revival of baseball whenever they heard about Jackie Robinson coming, right? So before that, and I'd mentioned to you guys before that softball was very popular in African-American communities at that point. You had church leagues and you had little, community leagues and those kind of things. But with the advent and the coming of, this great patriarch for Black America, right? The first civil rights leader, Jackie Robinson, so too became this popular of black baseball again, especially in Tulsa. And so many of these people who played on these softball teams, they just transitioned back to baseball. They grew up playing baseball. Many of them grew up with many of the baseball mentors who played before that, people who played for the Tulsa Colts and people who played for the Tulsa Black Whalers. So these young men in the community, they go to Alfonso Williams, and Hollis Hughes was the man who played on this baseball team. He knew Alfonso because Alfonso had a convenience store, he had a local tavern, he had a nightclub, he sold the best gas in town, and he had this large plot of land. And for those who are Tulsans and they know the layout of Tulsa, if you're familiar where Booker T. Washington is today, at the end of Virgin Street is a cul-de-sac. That's where the arterial line of Highway 75 went through. Okay. At that cul-de-sac, 2,200 East Virgin. It's 2200 Virgin Street. At the intersection of Xanthus Place was this complex that Alfonso Williams had built. Again, he had an apartment that people could rent the upper levels of the apartment, and he had this plot of land. It's just across Butter Creek from where BC Franklin Park used to be. So Alfonso had this place, and so he didn't grow into money. He was a young man who came from Texas via Oklahoma City. He actually came up after the Tulsa Race Massacre to help alleviate burdens for people.
So not related to the Williams family that we know, the Dreamland and stuff like. He
No,
came
a different
afterward.
Williams.
Okay,
Correct. And so he made his money as a cab company owner. He had Your Cab Company, Y-O-U-R, Your Cab Company, and it was stationed out of Greenwood. And he established that cab company because he wanted his people to be able to travel safely within the community. From point A to point B, they traveled safely because they were with their own. He made a great deal of money. He became wealthy, and he enlarged his portfolio with the different businesses. So it's not just one single thing. At this point in the late 1940s, early 1950s, he has become a successful businessman, and at that point, he is the single largest employer of Black Tulsa, period. Over the duration of his time as a business owner, he hired thousands of people, employed, and took care of thousands of people. And so he has this plot of land, and it's right next to Dirty Butter Creek. And Hollis Hughes comes up to Alfonso and he says, "Would you mind if we practiced on your open field of land here?" He's like, "No, I don't mind that at all. Have fun." And so.
And this was the T-Town Clowns.
This was the people who became the T-Town Clowns. Hollis Hughes was one of the softballers.
Yes.
And so some of these other guys who played softball with Hollis Hughes, he asked if they could practice baseball in this open field adjacent to his tavern and his nightclub, the Rose Room. You might have heard of the Rose Room. The Rose Room was an entertainment venue where it had this stage that rose out of the floor, and like Ike and Tina played there, and Ike Cole, Nat King Cole's brother, like Ray Charles, like lots of black entertainers played there. So he'd already kind of established his reputation with the community, and these young men play on the ball field there, and he notices that they are really talented. And in that moment, he says, "I'm gonna make y'all a ball club." And he has a really high voice, and he's a man of small stature, and he's known for carrying around these large keys on his pocket. So he just jingles, right? He's like, all those keys mean that he owns all these different doorknobs.
Yeah.
And he buys uniforms, and he builds a baseball park for the Tulsa T-Town Clowns. He names them the Clowns because clowns is indicative of color. If it's blue or it's black or it's clowns and occasionally giants, there are these names or these monikers that are associated with African-American baseball, and he calls them the T-Town Clowns. That's not to diminish the talent that was on this club. As a matter of fact, they would pantomime and shadow ball and still beat you.
Yes, yeah.
So he buys uniforms. He builds a baseball park, and as far as I have found at this point is that Alfonso Williams, aside from the three African American men who owned black baseball parks in the Negro leagues, the professional big black leagues,
Yes.
Alfonso Williams is the only man to have built, ran, and operated a black baseball park on his own dime, and it happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
How long was that team and that ballpark around in Tulsa?
The T-Town Clowns played in that ballpark from about 1946 to about 1955, 53, 55.
So then at that point, minor league baseball had become fully integrated?
It was integrating at that point. Right. A lot of people think that after Jackie Robinson integrated, that all baseball integrated.
Right.
It was a much longer and arduous journey for many of those people coming afterwards.
Indeed.
Oklahoma City baseball did not integrate until 1952 with an Iwo Jima veteran, Bill Greason, who is now a man of the cloth, still alive in his 90s, in his late 90s, as a matter of fact.
Wow.
In 1953, Charles Byron Chuck Harmon integrated the Tulsa Oilers, and he did not have a good experience here. So from 1947 to the mid-50s, integration was still happening throughout all of the other professional leagues.
Right.
But while this is happening, right, there's that revitalization of black baseball within those black communities. And so you have these young men who could have played baseball. I know for a fact they were offered minor league contracts, but because baseball was still integrating, they would have to go to Canada. Sylvester Nichols told me that from his lips, that he had a good job working for Spartan Aircraft, supporting his family. He was a married man.
Here in town.
And playing
family.
softball or baseball on the side with the Clowns.
Right, and that's semi-pro.
Yes.
Semi-pro, to many baseball historians, is kind of like this, there's a little resentment that comes with that name, is that, they weren't professional because they still worked another job and they just got paid, whatever, half the gate receipts or, maybe $300 for the season. They weren't pros.
Right.
But I would argue...
These are guys that would have played the game for nothing.
Absolutely. Especially if they're
and
getting...
had day jobs. So, I mean, they were working twice as hard.
Exactly, Pat. That's the thing that I would argue is that semi-pro, I think, is that much better.
Yes.
Because... these men, especially if you think about, the jobs that many African-American men had in the 1940s and 1950s,
right.
They're janitors and they're floor sweeps and they're laborers.
Yes.
Okay? That these men are working 40, 50, 60, 70, sometimes 90 hours a week and still playing baseball.
For the love of the game.
Exactly. And and many of these people are war veterans and they're family men. They'd already started families, right? This is after the war is over. So this is the baby boom. They're already starting families.
Right.
So that's all happening during that time. And, for all intents and purposes, they played at Virgin Street Park from about 1946 to 1955. And at that point, there was some kind of cronyism going on, and because Alfonso was a successful black businessman, there were some shady practices that basically crucified him for being a successful black businessman, and he went to prison for tax evasion.
Wow.
The same thing they get gangsters for in the 30s.
Yes.
Those kind of stories, the same thing happened. And so at that point, Alfonso lost control of Virgin Street Park. That was the name of the park, Virgin Street Park. Mm-hmm. The city of Tulsa then took it over, and that became Babe Ruth Park. And that's where the Babe Ruth League played in the 1950s and 1960s until the ballpark fell apart. So the Clowns played at Virgin Street Park, their very own park, and they played white teams because during that time, integration had happened, and they played white teams. They played those oil teams that you talked about, Pat, is that they would come from all over the region, from Texas, from Arkansas, from Kansas, from Missouri, from Texas, all of these different places, and they played there, and then they played abroad. Right. They had showers, they had... a grandstand and bleachers. They had concessions and all that stuff. It was a ballpark.
Indeed.
So for that, decade or a little bit more, that's where they called home. And that was the glory years of the Clowns. And then after that, that's where everything comes full circle, is that they went back to where they played softball in early days of baseball, which was Lincoln Park, which is now today's Lacey Park, where the Tulsa Rumblers play, which is my ball team. So there's a lot of history in that area.
Yes.
And speaking of those periods of time, Jackie Robinson actually played in Tulsa in 1948 But like we always seem to forget that Tulsa's influence in the country in the early 1920s and 30s, we had many big timers. And you were telling me a little bit about, the Oilers were a minor league team, but they played exhibitions with these professional teams like Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox, and that brought Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig here in 1929, only to lose 12-9. And it said Gehrig had a 3-run homer, Ruth with 2 singles, and Ruth almost caused a riot due to a memorabilia baseball that he threw into the crowd. And what was interesting is Gehrig returned 10 years later with teammate Joe DiMaggio. Gehrig's poor performance was really a sign of his debilitating disease that he would announce only a month later, and also be named after him, of course. And so, I'm sure there were other heavy hitters that made it through Tulsa. Is there any that come to mind immediately? We've obviously mentioned a handful already, but I think maybe for people to understand that professional teams playing minor league teams, could you explain maybe that just a little bit?
Barnstorming.
Yeah.
During this time, right? This predates the golden era by about 10 or 20 years. There are 2 important barnstorming outfits that you really need to pay attention to. One was Bob Feller and Satchel Paige. They had Bob Feller's All-Stars and Satchel Paige All-Stars, and they traveled all over, not just in the contiguous United States, but they would play in Mexico, in the Caribbean, and in far-reaching places. So you have that outfit, and also that go kind of like synonymously with that is that many of the times those big name ball clubs, particularly like the New York Yankees and the St. Louis Cardinals and teams of that stature, they would schedule these games in different places as an extension of the baseball season. So it would either be an extension of spring training, okay, in February, March, April, maybe even into early May, right? Depending on how operations worked. And then many people don't realize now is that, baseball goes into November now with all of the extending of postseasons and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But baseball had ended in early October. So that left about 6 weeks of play that you could play in almost anywhere in the United States. Additionally, at that point, Tulsa was the oil capital of the world. That's where all the influential architects are coming. That's where all of the money is coming. That's where all of the commerce is happening. So you have the Tulsa Oilers, which are the farm team of many different teams. They were the farm team of the Cubs and the Pirates and, most notably for the St. Louis Cardinals. But that was also a draw because McNulty Park was built. It was a ballpark that lasted from 1919 to 1929. That ballpark was built as a facsimile of Sportsman Ballpark in St. Louis. So it was a ballpark that drew teams to come. It was a playground for multiple people to come to. And so through that you have people like Dizzy Dean, who was the first barnstormer with Satchel Paige. And then when Rapid Robert comes along, Bob Feller comes along, he's the one who picks up that torch and still plays with Satchel because Satchel had a rubber arm. Mm-hmm. He played forever. But that's what brought those to town. You either had the barnstormers who were coming as an exhibition. So, and also to that point, you had the Kansas City Monarchs. The Kansas City Monarchs came to Tulsa all the time. And in many ways, the Tulsa Black Oilers throughout the 1920s was like this kind of makeshift minor league team for the Kansas City Monarchs.
Yes, yeah.
Well, you mentioned obviously a few black teams. How many were in Tulsa? You said the Oilers, the Clowns. How many others were there?
Almost every team in Oklahoma that had a sizable black population had a black ball club.
Sure.
So Tulsa's included with that, mm-hmm. right? You have a whole community.
So you had Muskogee, you had Redbird. Did they have a team? them.
You had almost every one of the black towns. Boley had the Boley Wonders. You had Clearview, had the Clearview Rockets. Renniesville had one. Tatum's. Foreman, Oklahoma is named after the Foreman family, and Zach and Sylvester Foreman came from Foreman, Oklahoma. They played for the Kansas City Monarchs. And then, so you have all of these well-endowed players who are, playing competitive baseball, and under the auspices of, it's not structured like minor league baseball, but there's still a conduit. And Tulsa's close to Kansas City.
Sure.
Also, there's also the Jazz line, the Jazz Depot, right?
Yes.
So Jazz comes from Kansas City, goes to New Orleans. You have St. Louis and you have Tulsa. That's kind of those pit stops in between. So with all of that happening, you have these means of transit to go between the different communities. And so Tulsa was one of those communities. And in 1922, the Tulsa Black Oilers had probably 5 or 7 players who either played for the Kansas City Monarchs and were lasting out their last years, or they were up-and-comers. But there were multiple teams to be, just to answer the question directly. The most notable teams that I have covered were the Tulsa Colts that existed in the 19-teens. They were the team that played in the first segregated ballpark, Association Park, which is, for contemporary terms, it's in the same block where Magic City Books is.
Yes, the Archer Building.
Yes. So that whole block was where Association Park was. And in 1914, they publicly segregated that because there was a threat of boycott from white patrons because African Americans had sat in the grandstand.
That is unbelievable. But yeah. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then.
Unfortunately, it's really not that unbelievable. And
true, when you look at the events of 7 years later, yes.
Well, but I mean, it's an unfortunate thing that integration really put an end to the Negro League in a sense. I mean, if you take the best players out, I mean, then it doesn't really have the same capacity that it did.
Right, because one of the things that I discovered as I unpacked the chronological history of black baseball in Oklahoma, and much of that was through the lens of Tulsa, is by the late 1940s and early 1950s, it's not just integration. It's the creature comforts of home. You have air conditioning for the first time. You have radio broadcasts and now television broadcasts. Right. You have all of these different things where people in the community, whether they're black or they're white, they're watching the exploits of singular people succeeding versus as a whole, as a cohesive unit. And so that also led to the demise of like the Negro Leagues and that kind of thing, is that it was the success of one versus over the regional popularity of a team. I should mention that in 1915, the Tulsa Colts were also the same team that won the state championship in the very same ballpark where they would not be permitted to sit in the grandstands. So that 1915 team is certainly one of note. But here we are 100 years later. The 1922 Tulsa Black Oilers is probably the greatest black baseball team that has ever played in Tulsa. Of course, we know what happened in late May and early June 1921. After the chaos that ensued, that many people, half of a community, were taken to McNulty Baseball Park in June 1st of 1921. They were corralled like prisoners, quote unquote, for their protection. That some 12, 13 months later, you have a black baseball team that for all of 1921, there wasn't much black baseball that existed at all. You have a season removed, and in early 1922, the Tulsa Black Oilers, which are now kind of connected with the Kansas City Monarchs, they come out of the the gates like literally swinging. They won the first 30 of 34 games that season.
Wow.
And back then, those seasons were very short. So I wanted to make sure to mention that, especially with this being the centennial of that season, that the Tulsa Black Oilers of 1922 were gangbusters. They were just a powerhouse. They featured many of the guys who went on to play for the Monarchs. So those were really some important teams from that era.
That's a great tale of the resilience and, again, reference to Greenwood Rising.
And another thing, and this is, of course, a sports topic, but it was that same year that Booker T. Washington football won the state championship. So it kind of parallels that same story, from rags to riches in a sense.
Didn't they play at McNulty? Didn't they play that football game? Where did they play that football game?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I remember seeing the photos of the team, obviously. And
when we reference McNulty, where was McNulty located?
McNulty Ballpark exists. It was at
Home Depot.
Right. For those people, for those
Market.
Tulsans, it's where 10th and 11th converge at Elgin. So that caddy corner that comes up from 11th that turns into 10th right there at the corner, that's where McNulty
Traffic
Park
circle?
was. Yes. Basically, if you can imagine where the warehouse market Art Deco building is and the parking lot for Home Depot, that was the configuration of McNulty Baseball Park.
And then Oilers Park, there's still, like we mentioned, a home plate there. And it was just not too long ago that Harry Carey's grandchildren were doing the sod poodles, Amarillo
That's right.
sod poodles. They're actually the announcers, so it's interesting. They did an interview with them with Channel 6 and just kind of asked them about, I guess the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree when it comes to broadcasting.
And baseball.
Yeah. And so, obviously, the Tulsa Oilers, before they left in the 70s, they played in 7 different stadiums since their history in the early 1900s. Where did these Negro League teams play?
Oftentimes, they played in the same stadiums. Now, it depended on what era. If you're talking about black baseball in the late 1800s or early 20th century, in the early 1900s, is that sometimes it was pasture ball. Baseball was not as sophisticated as it is, or even as it was in the 1950s or so. So a lot of times baseball was occurring. It may have had ramshackle bleachers or a grandstand. They were still playing in what would be considered a pasture, no outfield fences and those kind of things. But as those stadiums began building, the 2 different incarnations of Athletic Park and those kind of things, is that eventually by the 19aughts, 19 teens, that's where you started to see these different stadiums that were being shared. And it wasn't like this was, Commonwealth. It's these teams were renting these stadiums whenever the white team was out of town.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, even with my research, we see that there were company teams and even industry leagues. I mean, the Petroleum League, and so what was that all about? I mean, they were obviously sponsored by these companies, and I just remember seeing the Petroleum League and just kind of thought it was interesting.
Yeah, so to John's point earlier, he mentioned the McBurney brothers, is that you might say that they were like the early pioneers of what would become industrial leagues or petroleum leagues or town ball leagues. Mm-hmm. They were all there for some reason. It might have been a grocery store, it might have been a confectionery, it might have been a bank, it might have been something like that, where these players would come to that town for a certain reason. Most often it was because of their baseball talent. But you had this syndicate, if you will, of these different teams that would play, and oftentimes it was for bragging rights. But there's an element of, if they were brought to town, they were brought for a reason, and so sometimes they would be hired as ringers, or ringers being that they were hired for one reason, but was employed for a different reason as a ball player or something like that.
Were any of those early teams integrated?
As far as I can tell, most teams were not integrated, but they played interracial ball. So there's a difference. Integrated would mean that there are African Americans who play on a white team. But so that didn't happen. Jim Crow was the first order of business in establishing Oklahoma governance and those kind of things, especially with statehood.
Unfortunately, yes.
First order of business was Senate Bill 1, which thereby segregated public places, it segregated transit, and it outlawed interracial marriage. So that was the first order of business. So Jim Crow was a social policy during early statehood. But even before that, it was already an unspoken rule. It was one of those things where it just didn't happen. It was a cultural subscription. But that didn't prevent the fact that Oklahoma was one of the last great melting pots. You have so many different people coming from so many different areas to stake their claims. You have the displaced people who come here, not by choice, but through cultural genocide, with the Native Americans having to make their trek west with the Trail of Tears and those kind of things. But beyond that, you have freedmen, you have the Great Migration, you have people who are coming here for religious freedoms, you have people coming here for just trying to get a piece of the promised land. So all of that happening, you have this great cultural melting pot. It's not just New York. It's like these are happening in different places. And so with that, you have the establishment of black towns. We had, innumerable black towns in the early days of Oklahoma. But there's also like these episodes of amicability. I used to call it harmony, but it wasn't harmony because there's no way that it was harmonious. But it was amicability.
Yes.
And to your question, John, is that there was not interracial ball to speak of, or at least that wasn't reported on that I found, but there was interracial ball. And many times, once or twice a year, the town white team would play the town black team, and it would be for city bragging rights or just for exhibition. So that did happen in the early days, but it was, there still was also that backhanded part where is if the black ball team was doing well and it's in the 6th or 7th inning, there was also this unspoken rule that they would have to kind of fall back on their heels a little bit to let the white team win if they wanted to get out of town alive.
Yeah. Wow.
And when we talk about both or really all of these leagues versus today, is this the same rules? Is this how close is it to today's baseball?
The baseball that was played?
Yeah, you had referees and stuff like that, or? Sure,
it was all like sanctioned. You had umpires and you had foul lines, and the great thing that many baseball historians write about is that baseball is a game of democracy. And in such a tumultuous era, you wouldn't think of baseball being democratic. But between those baselines, and for the most part, since the early establishment of rules that Henry Chadwick had written about, they're the same, is that you have the same amount of pacing between the bases. You have the same amount of pacing between the mound and the home plate. It's a game of geometry. And within those baselines, it's a game of democracy. You have 3 strikes, you have 4 balls, you have 3 outs per half inning. And you have 9 innings to do it. There's not a time clock. So that's the democratic part of it. And so to answer your question, yes, there was structure. There's an infrastructure there that established what these rules were. And through those devices, if you had a fair arbiter of the game, the umpire, then it truly is whatever the athletic prowess of each player and those teams combined together can produce.
And that's why it's America's game, correct? Other than the fact that it was invented here, the democracy kind of goes hand in hand,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I've always been impressed, and it's just unbelievable to me, the mathematics involved and the fact that it hasn't changed and it is so consistent. And to have, plays that come down to split seconds based on that mathematics is just, again, to me, just amazing.
But even speaking outside of American culture, you did research on the DR, the Dominican Republic. So how did that all come about? And I guess tell us a little bit about that.
That actually happened before my work in researching the history of black baseball in Oklahoma.
Okay.
In 2011, I went on a self-study project to the Dominican Republic. I had, by that time, kind of committed myself to learning about the nuances of baseball history and applying academic studies and research to that to learn about how, the nuances of the game exist. It's more than just home runs. It's more than just who won the game. It's more than just, a box score. And I was able to set up this trip that I went on through networking with a man who his grandfather had owned the first baseball team in Houston, the Houston Colt 45s. And
great name.
Yeah. And I mean, it was it was a pivotal time for Texas baseball, especially. And so this man's grandfather had owned this major league ball team, and I knew him through social circles. And I said, "You go to the Dominican Republic pretty often, right?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he told me, he said, he does all this stuff and he does mission work and those kind of things. And I asked him if he did any baseball stuff, because I knew that was the hotbed for Latin baseball, is the Dominican Republic. You have the likes of, Sammy Sosa came from the Dominican Republic. And, I know that he kind of carries this albatross around his neck now of the steroid era.
Of course.
But make no mistake that whenever he was in the Texas League, he was tearing it up. He's a product of the Tulsa Drillers, and he wasn't here long.
No.
So you have those episodes of all these great players who came from the Dominican Republic and other places like Venezuela and Puerto Rico and Costa Rica and, those other, Caribbean countries that are connected to baseball in some way. So I asked him if he had any connections to baseball down there, and he says, "Well, I only know the 16th most powerful man in baseball." And he introduced me to this man, Epifanio Guerrero, and he was the man who largely helped spearhead the Dominican movement into Major League Baseball in the 1960s and 1970s. He worked with the Toronto Blue Jays, and many of the great players who came up in the early 1990s were a product of Epi's baseball camps. And so, longer story short, I went down there, and Epi picked me up from the airport, and it was this magical thing. I'd been to different countries, and I've been on vacations and that kind of thing. But when I pull up, I meet Epi, and he's got these lokes, these dark black sunglasses on, and he just looks like the Caribbean dawn. And I'm just he's wearing this I don't know what the name of the shirts are, but it's clearly a button-down shirt because he's from a different era. You don't wear T-shirts, you dress up everywhere you go. And he's wearing this button-down shirt, and just the imposing figure. And I remember I traveled down with the man that I mentioned earlier, and he was going on his way and I was going on my way to the camp. And we were trying to get basketballs and volleyballs through customs. And there was a hang up because there were lots of basketballs and lots of volleyballs. And they're like, you can't bring this here. And the guy that I connected with, he said, "They're Eppies." And they were like, "Oh." And they just waved their hands on. And all you had to do was mention Epi's name. And so he was a great impact on Dominican history. And actually, whenever I got to his mansion, he had a wing of his mansion that was the Dominican Baseball Hall of Fame. And so he took me around, and I'm trying not to wax poetic, but man, it was just so beautiful there. He took me there, and you pull up on this hill, and the Dominican Republic is paradise already. But you're pulling up, and it's into this country area. But before we get there, he drives me up, and we stop at this cantina. And he asked me if I drink beer, and I was like, "Oh yeah." And he's like, "Well, you need to have Dominican water." And we belly up to the bar, and he orders 2 Presidente beers. It's Dominican water. And this girl, she's sucking on a mango. freshly picked off the tree from across the street.
Whoa.
And we get our Presidente beers, and I swear that's probably the best beer I've ever sipped. And we're sitting there, and the entrance of this cantina, you guys have to understand the impact of baseball, is the entrance of this cantina are hand-carved fences made out of baseball bats.
Whoa.
So all of the posts are baseball bats. And so we go there, and from there, we drive past his camp. We don't go to his camp. We go to the next community on the other side of the camp. And we go to this open air bar. We did the same thing. We belly up to the bar. There are some old gentlemen playing dominoes who used to be ball players. And this is how Epi introduces me to his community. He takes me to these bars, these cantinas. It's not a bar. It's a community atmosphere. And from there, we have two beers in us now, and he takes me to the camp. And you pull up, and you see this just broken down baseball field. It's just palm tree trunks and riddled, pepper-ridden fence and fishing nets just barely holding this together. And you look up upon the hill, and there are 3 beautifully manicured major league fields.
Whoa.
Sitting adjacent to this just broken down baseball field. And so that was my introduction. He explained to me the importance of that broken down ball field, is that's where the boys learn fundamentals. He said if it was that good for me in the 50s and 60s, it's that good for these boys now. And they see those fields across the way, and that's what they aspire to play on. So, yes, I know that I spoke poetic for a long time about that, but it was such a magical experience. And, that's what's great about baseball. Is that, I do more than just baseball history, but there's such humanity to discover. And it doesn't matter where you're from, what your last name is, or what your bottom line in the box score is. It's a matter about humanity and who plays the game. And that's what I've discovered in all these researches. I'm sorry I've kind of long-winded.
We appreciate you sharing that story, and I think to get to that same point, a lot of us PBS fans saw the Ken Burns baseball doc, and he really puts that into a poetic sense as well, and encompasses really everybody.
So yeah, that Dominican connection I think is amazing, because that connection with American baseball and Dominican Republic goes back a ways. We've talked about a lot of notable names so far, and one of the players that I've always been fascinated with is Satchel Paige. Reese Martin last episode told us about a Dollop podcast, which I've really come to enjoy. They have a great episode about Satchel Paige, and specifically when Satchel Paige played in the Dominican Republic in 1937. He played 30 games down in Dominican Republic. He was played, he's one of the great Negro ball players from that era. He played 30 games in the Dominican Republic and made $30,000 cash delivered in a briefcase to his hotel room. And just to kind of put that into perspective, just a couple years before, Babe Ruth made $35,000 for playing a full MLB season. So they had, a great baseball and really appreciated baseball and their black players more than we did here in the United States. But ultimately, Satchel Paige ended up here in Tulsa as part of the Oilers organization. So how did that come about?
Satchel Paige is one of those notables who came through the oil capital. And the great thing about it is that you have to understand the culture of baseball at the time is that in the golden era, the 1950s and early 1960s, there were major league experiments, right? That's after integration. That's with Jackie Robinson already crossing the baselines in 1947, April 15th, 1947 at Ebbets Field. But there were many people experimenting with the game, and one of the great baseball owners of the day was Bill Veeck. He was one of those who saw the potential of black baseball being played And even though he was not the first person to champion integration, he still, flirted with the idea and had lists of players that he would like to see. And so, but he's also the showman. He's the guy who owned the Cleveland Indians and owned the Chicago White Sox at one time. And, the reason why you have the exploits of like fireworks in games and, playing around with uniforms and those kind of things, the reason why the Savannah Bananas are bananas right now is because you have those guys who came way before.
Great videos those guys put out.
Oh, yeah.
They're mentioned all the time on how they basically have capitalized on the social media, and now everyone knows them. And so, but I didn't mean to interrupt it.
The Savannah Bananas are just an outgrowth of good time baseball. Another good time baseball team was the St. Paul Saints, Minnesota Saints. Same kind of thing, owned by Mike Veck, who is Bill Veck's son, and Bill Murray. So if you have those two together, you're bound to have this great baseball club. The reason why I preface with that information is because minor league baseball was in a shakeup too. The minor leagues had been developed by Ban Johnson and Branch Rickey and those early baseball guys in the 1920s, 1930s, and into the early 1940s, developing these talents that feed the major leagues. Well, after the golden era of baseball and subsequently into the 1960s with the establishment of free agency and the getting rid of the reserve clause where you're stuck with a team for 10 years, not by choice, but by contract, is that you start to see the shakeup of baseball. And so in the 1960s and 1970s, minor league baseball is kind of struggling. They're not as firmly footed as they are now. And so you have to have some imaginative owners and general managers. And one of those people was A. Ray Smith. A. Ray Smith owned the Tulsa Oilers from 1960 to 1976. And then whenever they left, he still owned the team. And so he took them with him. And A. Ray Smith he loved baseball. He was actually a general manager of the Tulsa Oilers before that. So he had some interest, and he worked with Grell Howlett, who was the GM and the lead guy of the Oilers before that. So A. Ray was committed to Tulsa. And after he garnered control of the Tulsa Oilers, that's whenever Oiler Park became Oiler Park. Before that, it was Texas League Park. And that can be confusing because Oklahoma City also had a Texas League Park. That was not uncommon for ballparks to be called that. But A. Ray Smith, he changes it to Oiler Park, and that's a moniker that we know that stadium as now,
of course,
even though the Tulsa Drillers played in it in their early years.
And the iconic photos that say that on the front of it, too.
And the great thing about that ballpark is that every year they would paint a new mural on the front of it.
Nice.
So I tell you all that backstory, John, to tell you that that's how Satchel Paige became involved, because A. Ray Smith, he saw some of these people in their their golden years or their twilight years of their careers, and some of those people, they didn't have baseball pensions. So they became ambassadors of the game. And so Satchel Paige was involved with the Tulsa Oilers after the Warren Spahn era. So Warren Spahn was like the late 60s, early 70s, and then after Warren Spahn was that draw name, Satchel Paige comes in the picture, and he's really kind of this baseball ambassador, if you will. He was a pitching coach too, but also he was photo ops. And, he was brought here, he was paid to be here. And I've talked to Robert Page. I talked to him at a conference one time, and I asked him about the Page involvement in A. Ray Smith, and Robert Page could not sing A. Ray's praises high enough. He said that A. Ray, even after they left Tulsa, took care of not just Satchel Paige, but the Page family. And so we have that. We have the fact that we had this great baseball man. He was a minor league baseball guy. But if you look at the history and the impact of baseball, you can't talk about that without talking about A. Ray Smith.
So you were talking about when Warren Spahn was here as a manager for the Tulsa Oilers. Now, you got to meet Warren Spahn, right? He settled, once he came to Tulsa, he loved it, settled out in Broken Arrow, right?
Yes, I met Warren Spahn, but it's a memorable story. I'll give you that. He's not from Oklahoma. He actually is from Buffalo, New York, and he married a girl from Hartshorn, Oklahoma. And so they built a life together, and he settled in Hartshorn. He had a ranch there. And then in his later years, after his wife had passed, he and Greg, his son, settled in the Broken Arrow area, and that's where he lived out the rest of his years. And my story is besides, talking about it today, is seemingly insignificant in the life of Warren Spahn. Warren Spahn is the greatest left-handed pitcher to have ever played the game, but he's also a part of our Tulsa baseball history. He was the manager of the Tulsa Oilers, and at that time it was AAA. It was Pacific Coast League, and that's the highest he ever got. He was a coach, a pitching coach, and I think a bench coach for the Cleveland Indians after the Tulsa Oilers, but he never got to manage, and he wanted to manage. But he was our manager, and at least in the lore that I've studied and I've lived through, is that when we talked about the Tulsa Oilers whenever I was growing up, we talked about them with the references the same as the St. Louis Cardinals or the New York Yankees. And Tulsa had Warren Spahn. Warren Spahn, the greatest left-hander to ever play in the game. He was the manager from 1967 to 1972, and I got to meet him 3 months before he passed away. And I heard that they were going to have a statue unveiling in Pawhuska. This is way before the Pioneer Woman and the draw to Pawhuska. But back then, there was a foundry. There was a bronze foundry there, and I forget the name of the author, but he had made a 1.5 times bust of Warren Spahn and his huge kick of him as a...
that's what I remember of him from the pictures, that leg.
Yeah, the leg kick. And this was a bronze of him in a Braves uniform, right? He was a career Brave for the most part. He retired with the Mets, but we all know him as a Milwaukee and Boston Brave. And so I went there, and I remember at the time that this may be the only time I get to meet this guy. And I didn't go with any expectations other than I took a team photograph of the Tulsa Oilers from 1972 with Warren Spahn as manager. So I go up to Pawhuska, and there's probably 300 people at this small event. Many people who are there just because they're locals and something is happening in their community. And so at this time, Warren Spahn is in a wheelchair, and I don't know any of the people that are involved. I see some people who look like they know what they're doing, and then all of a sudden I see Warren Spahn wheeled out in this wheelchair. Come to find out, it was his son Greg, and then Richard Hendricks, who was the guy who established and curated the Oklahoma Sports Museum in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The reason why that bust exists is because of Richard Hendricks. Richard Hendricks was a visionary. He's still alive. He's a visionary, and he established the Guthrie, which is now the Guthrie Sports Museum. They built this bronze statue, and it was to be unveiled at Turner Field. Ted Turner, who owned the Braves, Turner Field.
Sure.
They're going to unveil this statue there, but before they go, they're going to have Warren Spahn come out to kind of, give his blessing and have some photo ops and send it on its way. So Warren Spahn comes out there, and he's wearing this light blue cardigan, and they give him the microphone, and he's jovial, and he says, "Well, I just hope that the pigeons don't doo-doo on it," right? He says, something like that, and we all laugh, and at that point, they wheel him towards his car, and he's flocked by all these people who want to see him and get his autograph. And then whoever it was who was putting on the event said he's not signing autographs. It's just like, oh man, I missed my opportunity. And at that time, I owned that car shop, and I remembered what kind of car he was driving. And Craig Day from I believe it was News on 6, he had been assigned to the event, and he interviewed Warren Spahn, standing next to him and asking him about the statue and his career and those kind of things. And they had this little biopic on him on the news. And after that, they got in their car and they left. And I shook Warren Spahn's hand, and I remember it was like shaking a grandpa's hand, how soft and how delicate it felt.
Yes.
And, this guy survived World War II. I mean, he's a battle-hardened veteran.
Right.
And it was surreal at that point. I wasn't a historian, and I just was a baseball fan. And they left, and I thought, man, I missed my opportunity. And I thought to myself, well, I'm just by myself. I'm in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, which I'm an hour from home. Most people who go to an event stop to get something to eat. Maybe I'll have a chance there to meet and talk to him. And so I go into downtown Pawhuska, and I mean, people will later interpret this as a stalker story, I'm sure. So I remember I make my loop through downtown, and I mean, I'd been to spring training games and that kind of stuff before that, so I had met ball players, and so I thought, well, maybe this is the opportunity that I can get. I would really like him to sign my Tulsa Oilers team picture.
Sure.
And I go through town, and I spot the car that they were in, and it was at the Whiz Bang Cafe.
Whiz Bang.
Yeah, and it's
legendary.
It's no longer there, but they had the best plum tea in Oklahoma. It was a great place to. It was a diner atmosphere and had a great menu. And I come in, and I remember this lady who was younger than I am at that time. She walks up to me and she's like, "What do you want?" And I was like, "Well, do I seat myself or do I, or what?" And she goes, "Oh, I thought you were with them." And so I was like, "Oh, no."
You're in. Yeah. Yes, I am.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, "No, I'm just me." And so she sits me over at this bar, and it was in two conjoining buildings that had an opening, that one larger and one smaller. And there was a bar in the smaller part. And I sit down between these two men, and one man has a signed baseball, and the other man has a signed facsimile picture of Spahn's baseball card. I thought, okay, he's signing. And it's just the three of us.
Right.
And I asked them, I said, "Did he sign that for you?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Do you think he signed this for me?" And I show them the picture, and they're like, "I don't know. Is he eating?" And I was like, "I don't know," because at that point, my vision of that party had been split. And so this other guy, he's kind of like my point man, my inadvertent point man. And he goes, "They're not eating right now. Now's your chance." I'm like, "Oh, man." So I take my little manila folder, and I come up to Mr. Spahn. And he's, like I said, he was in a wheelchair at this point. And I come up to him, and this is kind of the way that I greeted many ball players at the time. I said, "I know you get this all the time, but would you be willing to sign my team picture?"
Sure.
And he looks up and down at me. And at that time, I had a little like a Fu Manchu goatee, and I have lots of tattoos. And at this time, of course, I own my hot rod shop, so I proudly exhibited them with my personality at the. And so I asked him if he had signed this, and he looks me up and down. And remember, I'm standing; he's in his wheelchair,
right?
And he looks me up and down, and he's like. He grabs my left wrist, and he looks at my tattoos, and he's like, "What is that crap on your arm?"
Oh my!
And I said, "Oh, it's just my hot rod tattoos." And I'm thinking to myself, I'm about to offend the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time. And so I kneel down beside him, and he's like, "How many's with you?" And I said, "It's just me. It's just me." And he's like, "Well, what do you got?" And so I hand him he's very gruff, right? He's like a grandpa.
Right.
He's like, "What do you want? Get out of my
yard."
Yeah. And I hand him the manila folder, and he sees that this is a picture of him with the Tulsa Oilers. And I said, "It's just you and the Tulsa Oilers, and it'd be my honor if you signed it." And he signs it, and it's a very primitive autograph because he had an aged hand.
It is, yeah.
At that point. But as I'm kneeling next to him, like I said, I had that little beard, the little goatee thing. And he looks at me and he's like, "What's wrong with your razor?" I was like, "Oh, it's just my hot rod beard." And he grabs me by the tuft of my chin.
No way.
And he starts jerking my head around.
Yikes.
And I'm like, what is going on here? Like, I'm just trying to figure out how to get out of the situation.
Right.
And he lets me go. And at that point, he firmly sticks his fingers on top of the manila folder and he shoves it towards his lady friend that was there. And his wife had already been passed at this point, and I don't know what the relationship was, but she was sitting next to him, and he shows her this picture.
Yeah.
And he's like, "That's me when I was with Tulsa." And she's like, "Oh, that's nice." And so as I'm sitting next to him, and I said, "I appreciate that you took the time to do that, that you're a baseball legend in my life." And he's like, "Hell, they just paid me to play baseball." Like,
Right.
just was matter of fact. And,
Yeah.
and I knew I knew that he was a war veteran and that stuff at that point. And he hands it back to me, and I'm getting ready to leave, and his lady friend goes, "Just think, you'll now have the story to tell all your friends about how you met Warren Spahn." And I was like, "Yes, I do."
A story to tell, and we appreciate you sharing it with us.
It's one for the ages. And I went to Warren Spahn's funeral with my father, and kind of the capstone of meeting him. And then 3 months later, we were put on the front row at his
right?
at his service. And Muzon Biggs delivered his service at the Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. And Hank Aaron was there, Bud Selig, who was the commissioner of baseball, and a few of his teammates from his Braves days were there. And it was just it was surreal. I've
No doubt.
I've lucked into some baseball experiences for sure.
Unless there's anything else to mention, I mean,
Man,
We could do this for hours.
Yeah.
Apparently, is this going to be a 2-episode edition?
No, I think we this is the end of part one, and really, I'll go into the closing if unless there's anything else that we want to mention.
No, I mean I've mentioned plenty.
Okay.
Yes, and thank you so much, and thank you for all that you do.
We'll do that here in a second.
Okay.
Well, yeah, thanks for everything, Jake, and that will do it for this edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Patrick McNicholas, joined with
John Beasley.
And Jake Cornwell.
And if you have any thoughts, be sure to reach out, either social media, Tulsa Pass, tulsapass.com. We want to thank Jimmy, our audio engineer, guest Jake Cornwell, and our listeners who have been spreading the word about this podcast. We'll have another episode for you next month, and it's easy to find us, Tulsa Times Podcast. You'll see all the episodes listed. Like, follow, subscribe to stay up to date with the latest episodes. And thanks for listening to this episode 4, part 1 of Tulsa Sports History Baseball. This is the Tulsa Times Podcast.